Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ben Bernanke. It's my honor and privilege to be able to welcome you to this event honoring the work of Alan Krueger. Thanks are due to the Hutchins Center on Fiscal and Monetary Policy at Brookings and to the Economic Policy Institute for organizing and sponsoring this event. As I look out, I see many people here who are associated with Alan one way or another, have known him for a long time. I certainly have knew him for a long time, for many years as a colleague at Princeton, Woodrow Wilson School, Economics Department, and also when we were both in the policy world here in Washington during the Obama administration when Alan was at the CEA and at the Treasury. And I'm sure there have been and will continue to be many opportunities for us all to talk about Alan's role as a teacher, a mentor, a colleague, and a friend. However, today is not that day. Today is about the work. It's about the research. And it was indeed exemplary work. Alan, like many great scholars, stretched the boundaries of what his field was normally about. He did great work on employment and wages, but he also talked about inequality and happiness and quirky things like the rock music and the economics of terrorism. He was a tremendous contributor to what has been called the credibility revolution in economics. He brought some real credibility to empirical work through his innovation in terms of natural experiments, new data sets. For Alan, it was very important that the results be believable, credible, and replicable. And I think that's been a tremendous contribution that he made. And finally, Alan wanted to know the answers to these important questions, in part because they're relevant to our decision-making, to policy. I enjoyed many, many discussions with him in Washington when he would be looking at the policy question, not to find the talking point, not to find the rationale for what the administration wanted to do anyway, but to try to understand what was really going on. And I think that's an incredibly important attribute for a scholar. So what we have today is some panels, some discussions of Alan's work, and I'm hopeful that for all of us who are producers or consumers or both of economic research, that this session will be informative and inspirational. To give a little bit more color about what we're going to do today, let me introduce David Wessel, who is the leading light here at the Hutchins Center and a key organizer of this program today. David.
Thank you, Ben, and welcome everybody. We have a lot of people in this room standing. There's an adjacent room with seats and a full screen. You can see it, and we're live streaming this, so if you fall asleep, you may be embarrassed. It was a real challenge to figure out how to organize this event because of the breadth of Alan Krueger's work. Newspaper reporters, like I used to be, had come to learn about how many different things you could call Alan on a story and how much information he could give you about a topic as different as happiness or the intricacies of the labor market. So we decided to take a slice. So we're going to begin with a panel that looks on Alan's work on labor markets in particular, and we'll probably branch into inequality there. And that will be, and then I'm going to follow with a panel that looks at his work on education, which was just one slice of what he has did. We are not going to take oral questions today, but some of my colleagues will be passing through with index cards, and if you have a question, either for the panels or the later speakers, please give it to them and it'll come up and the moderator or the speaker will, if time permits, answer them. So we're going to, and then following these two panels, we're lucky, and I'll introduce him later, to have Steve Leisman from CNBC, who plays a role in Alan's book on rock music. And then finally, we'll have Dennis McDonough, former chief of staff to the president, to talk a little bit about what we learned from Alan, the economist, as policy advisor. And following all that, we invite you all to join us for a reception outside. So the first panel will be moderated by my co-sponsor of this event, Larry Michel. Larry used to be the director of the president, rather, of the Economic Policy Institute, wherein he'll discuss Alan's role in helping him with that. He did that for 15 years, and then he decided to get someone else run the place so he could just be a researcher again, which I understand is a common phenomenon in academia. So can I invite Larry up, and he'll introduce the rest of his panel. Thank you.
So I think you all have bios of people. We should all, are they supposed to have name tags or we're going to, in order of the presentation, will be Larry Katz, Alex Moss, and Catherine Abraham, who all share, like Alan, being university professors, but spending time in government. So Larry Katz is a Harvard professor. He was the first chief labor economist at the Department of Labor in the Clinton era, the granddaddy of them all, so to speak. Alan followed him in that. Alex from Princeton, but also was a chief economist at the Department of Labor under Obama, and Catherine Abraham from University of Maryland, who was a commissioner of BLS. So they all share that. And so we're first going to have Larry, then Alex, then Catherine, and then I'll say a few words and we'll have a discussion. You're up, Larry.
Okay. So I guess since I knew Alan from graduate school to having a 2019 working paper with him, that I've tried to bring some perspective to thinking about Alan, the labor economist and the empirical economist, and what his scholarly legacy is and will continue to be. And at a broad level, I would say there were, three really important things that Alan did. First, he, through a wide range of work, really revealed what real-world labor markets operate as compared to textbook competitive labor markets, brought in the reality of fairness considerations, employer power, frictions in the labor market, and showed that those were essential both for understanding inequality, the wage distribution, as well as for policy, including issues such as the minimum wage. So that's the first aspect, and Alex is going to go farther on that. The second, which is where I'm going to focus for a few minutes, was making economics and social science more scientific through being more experimental and more credible in empirical work, finding real-world natural experiments where there's sharp changes in the policy or the factor you're looking at, whether it's an experiment on class size, as in Tennessee, that Diane will talk about, or whether it's the quirks of compulsory schooling laws of age of birth, or whether it's sharp changes in federal or state minimum wages. Alan showed you had to look where there were clear areas of variation that you understood, and that gave you some both transparency in presenting empirical work. You can often see it just in a simple graph, as well as credibility. The third area is he not only made economics more scientific, he made it evidence-based, but also more humanistic by actually trying to figure out what people think and feel, whether it's happiness, whether it's the type of work they actually do and looking at alternative work arrangements, or whether it's the pain, both mental and physical, that the unemployed feel. Alan knew you had to go beyond traditional data sets, and Catherine is going to talk further about those contributions. What I want to do is talk a little bit about an example of Alan and the credibility revolution, one that created a lot of debates and issues concerning the minimum wage. And this actually goes back to the late 1980s, early 1990s, actually when I was visiting the Princeton IR section in 1989, and legislation came in to raise the federal minimum wage for the first time since 1981 from $3.35 an hour to $3.80 in April 1990 and $4.25 in April 1991. We knew there was a large literature on the minimum wage at the time, but it was pretty inconclusive in our view. The traditional approach to looking at the minimum wage, especially in a period where there weren't many changes, was what you might call let-it-rip regressions. You'd look at data on employment, say of teenagers, vulnerable groups, and you would compare it to some index of the minimum wage versus average wages, hope you could control for labor market conditions and just run a regression. And you got a bunch of, sometimes you found somewhat negative effects and economics would cheer. Sometimes you didn't. But the big worry is anything you couldn't measure about labor market conditions would tend to bias that towards a negative effect on employment because the average wage was in the denominator and was most of the variation. The experiment is the minimum wage itself changing. And that's what we had an opportunity to look at with the 1990 and 91 changes. So we actually started calling up every fast food restaurant in Texas, or at least Alan got some people to do it, came up with a survey to actually try to measure employment at the establishment level of firms we were pretty sure were going to be affected by the minimum wage in a low-wage state of Texas, and also tried to think hard about the issues. At that time, there was going to be a youth subminimum and training subminimum that seemed easy to use. Neoclassical theory says employers, if they were paying $335 yesterday and could continue to pay $335 today, should continue paying that. And what we found, first of all, was that almost no one used the youth subminimum once the actual minimum wage or training wage went up. They all felt they couldn't attract any workers, even though yesterday they attracted all their workers at $335 an hour. The other thing we found is that, in fact, the most impacted restaurants from the minimum wage didn't have declines in employment. They actually had, if anything, increases in employment relative to the ones that were paying well above the minimum wage. At the same time, David Card was doing similar work with a state change in California and found very similar things. The three of us then looked at state reactions to the 90 and 91 changes and found, again, if anything, a positive relationship. And at the same time, Harry Holzer, Alan Krueger, and I were looking at data on job applications and found that, in fact, there was a big spike when the minimum wage went up that looked like firms actually couldn't offset the minimum wage by cutting benefits. They made these jobs really attractive, and turnover went down. And so what I think is really important about the work Alan did is it was clearly using the natural experiment gave you a very different answer than the let it rip approach, but it wasn't just stopping at a graph of wages and employment. He, in collecting the data we did in the surveys and grabbing administrative data that he and David later did, tried to look at the full picture, to look at why were employers, what happened to their profitability, what happened to prices, what happened, what were the rationales why they weren't using the youth subminimum wage. It was largely fairness concerns and views that you couldn't attract it. And from that, a fuller picture of the labor market came out. There appeared to be a range. There was also a huge spike of wages at exactly the minimum wage, which you shouldn't see in a neoclassical labor market. We should displace workers if they weren't that productive. And so a richer understanding that there's a range of indeterminacy of wages and that the cloud of a minimum wage or a bargaining agent played a major role, and firms were not on their knife edge where they were going to lay everyone off if wages went up by epsilon. They basically had a range in which they could improve their selection, improve their turnover, get more effort, but that didn't eliminate all the rents. And the changes seemed to have not very large impacts on employment, but greatly reduced wage inequality. And I think what's striking is that 25 years further of research, we looked at two federal changes and one state law change. There have now been 142, and the latest 2019 paper by Sengiz, Aaron Dubé, Ben Zipperer, and Attila Lindner, using all 138, building on Alan's work, looking localized at wages, shows essentially in the range of U.S. minimum wage changes, you reallocate wages from just below the new minimum wage to just above it with very little impact on employment. And when you have 138, you can debate all you want about the problems of New Jersey and Pennsylvania, California, but it looks pretty systematic now. We don't know. There are a lot of questions. What's the 20-year impact of changing, the cost of labor? It's hard to assess from the variation exactly all the adjustments. But I think the bottom line is what Alan showed is that combining natural experiments, credible approaches with a deeper collection of data and with thinking hard about the way, talking to actors about their reactions, you can get a much fuller picture of the labor market, and that matters a lot rather than a knee-jerk reaction of a textbook demand curve for thinking about economic policy.
I'm going to read from something I wrote down. So I'd like to say something about Alan's motivation and approach to research. And first, briefly on motivation. Alan used to say that economics is not a dismal science, it is a hopeful science. This idea is memorialized in the first sentence of the first chapter of the 2013 Economic Report to the President, and was a guiding principle for much of his work. I know that he conveyed this message to the staff economists at CEA, and it's something that many of us who collaborated with Alan have taken to heart. On his approach, Alan is, as has come up a number of times, is well known for being one of the pioneers of the credibility revolution, and for his empirical work. Less appreciated, maybe, is his emphasis on institutions. Alan believed that you have to understand the institutions and the economic environment that you're studying, and took very seriously the idea of getting into the details of the industries and programs under analysis, and zooming in from the 30,000-foot view and talking to people, or economic actors, as we might write about them in papers. I was reminded of this reading the Kansas City Fed speech Alan gave on employer market power. In the speech, Alan describes talking to Jeffrey Suray. He's an RN and the lead plaintiff in a collusion case in the nurse labor market in Detroit. If you read the speech, you can see in that account how Alan learned something about employer market power from talking to this individual, and something that would feed into his research. I did some work with Alan in our own work linking the Bridgestone-Firestone strike to defective tires. Alan and I had in-depth conversations with the head of the United Steelworkers Union local in Decatur, Illinois, an auto executive, a trial attorney, an automotive engineer, among other people. The content of these conversations didn't necessarily make it into the paper, but they did help us understand the problem and inform the analysis. Economists generally prefer to look at what people do rather than what people say. Alan demonstrated that there is real value in listening to what people say. From the type of conversations I just described, to a survey work on self-reported life satisfaction, his work with Alan Blinder on offshoring, his work on reservation wages, just to name a few examples, there's a lot of insight that can be gleaned from just asking people. Alan understood that every labor market and institution is idiosyncratic, and that these different features have implications for wage setting and employment, whether it be non-competitive behavior like collusion or market power, agency issues, or anything else that economists call frictions. Alan was an early proponent of modeling the labor market in what he preferred to call its natural state, rather than the perfectly competitive textbook model that, at the time he was doing some of his major work, was more the norm. Alan's deep understanding of institutions and the economic environment was central to his pioneering work on efficiency wages, minimum wages, and many other topics. Some of his really important papers came from an industry that he knew very well, fast food franchising. His dissertation chapter on efficiency wages in corporate-owned versus franchise restaurants, the New Jersey minimum wage paper, and a recent paper on non-poaching agreements with Orley Ashenfelter. In this last paper, they documented the high incidence of no poaching agreements among franchise restaurants of the same company. The study was picked up shortly after by the New York Times, and soon after that led to an investigation into the practice by the Washington State Attorney General. In turn, this led to an agreement with numerous national restaurant chains to stop this practice. I personally cannot remember a labor economics paper that had a more rapid impact than this one, at least in recent past. And in terms of policy impact, I'm just scratching the surface. Larry's talked about the minimum wage, and there's going to be another panel on education. So I've been emphasizing a bit the policy impact, but I want to conclude by noting that Alan was a research powerhouse. He had more than 90,000 citations in Google Scholar, which is a huge number, and easily placed him in the league of Nobel Prize winners. If you look at the major wave of labor economics research over the past 3 decades, Alan was in many cases at the leading edge of it. His work with Larry Summers on inter-industry wage differentials, for example, set the stage for the major current area of inquiry on the role of firms in wage setting. The emphasis on these panels is largely on the micro side, but Alan has some really influential work on the macro side as well. His most cited paper, actually, is in growth economics, and he had some very early important work on measuring the labor share, unemployment, and labor force participation. Alan is one of the very, very few people who has had such a significant set of scholarly accomplishments, who easily moved between the micro and macro side of the economy, and who through popular writing could shape the economic debate at the highest levels, and who could successfully delve into the nitty-gritty of policymaking.
Thank you. As we've just heard from Larry and Alex, Alan made contributions to many areas of labor economics. What I would like to talk a little bit about is his contribution to the measurement of labor market activity. Certainly from my perspective, an important step in any empirical analysis of labor market outcomes is being sure that you have actually measured those outcomes correctly. Although that sort of work has become more common, Alan was really a pioneer in taking seriously the potential for errors in the survey data that economists rely on in studying the labor market, exploring the nature of those errors, and thinking about how those errors might be addressed. He wasn't just being critical, he was thinking about what you could do about it. I want to give just a couple of examples of his papers in this vein. There's been a lot of work in recent years that has made use of administrative data as an alternative to survey data for measuring things that it's difficult for survey respondents to tell you about. As in so many other areas, Alan was really ahead of the pack in doing this sort of work. I have always liked his 1991 paper with John Bound that explored errors in the earnings reported by respondents to the current population survey. Every year we ask people, how much did you earn last year? And a lot of the conclusions that we draw about what's going on in the labor market comes from those data. Alan was worried that those numbers weren't necessarily accurate, and what he and John Bound did in their paper was to compare the earnings that people reported in the CPS to what was reported for those same people in the Social Security earnings records. There's been and they found that they didn't always match up very well, among other things. There's been a lot of recent work in this vein. I've done work in this spirit. I see Bruce Meyer here. He and Jim Sullivan have done some really important work comparing what people say in the CPS about receipt of social insurance benefits to what the records show about those things. All of this work, in a very real sense, I would say, builds on some of the early work that Alan did. Just to give you a bit more of a flavor of some of the measurement work that Alan did that I think is interesting and important, I'll mention a paper that he wrote with Alex and Zitong New. I probably didn't say that name correctly. One of the things that's very odd about the current population survey is that people in the survey are interviewed 8 times. And depending which wave they're in, they give you different answers on average. And in this paper, Alan and his co-authors were interested in trying to figure that out. The usual explanation for why this happens is that people figure out the first time that they're interviewed that if they answer certain questions in a certain way, they're going to get asked more questions, and they don't want that to happen. But digging into this, beyond documenting that there were these rotation group effects, they found that you would expect that if that was the case, that if the issue is that you say you're unemployed or give answers that lead you to be categorized as unemployed, you're going to get asked more questions. If you've been asked those questions before, you should be less likely to report in the same way the next time. But it turns out that these effects actually were the strongest for people who were new to being unemployed, which doesn't fit with that story at all. This is sort of a case where we know what the problem is. It's less clear how to fix it. I could give other examples, but in the interest of time, I won't. I do want to say, though, that in addition to being concerned about the quality of the official statistics that are collected and produced and how they could be improved, Alan was also unafraid, in contrast to most economists, to go out and collect his own data. Larry's talked about this a little bit with the example of calling up employers to ask them about how they responded to the minimum wage. He actually, in 1993, founded the Princeton University Survey Research Center so that he would have the capacity to go out and ask people and businesses questions to which we wouldn't otherwise have answers. There's a lot of facts reported in papers that Alan wrote that came from data that he went out and collected. I'm, again, not going to be able to mention all of them, but just a few. Both the best evidence we have about how search intensity for people who are unemployed changes with the duration of their unemployment comes from data that Alan collected. We have data on time use that have been collected in other surveys, but you don't want to know just how people spend their time. You'd really like to know whether they're spending their time on things that they enjoy or things that they find stressful. We know that from work that Alan did. A fact that you've probably heard cited in the media is the finding that half of prime-age men who are out of the labor force say that they take pain medication on a daily basis. How do we know this? We know this because of information that was collected on a supplement to the American Time Use Survey that Alan was instrumental in designing and getting fielded. So there's a lot of things we know thanks to data that Alan went out and collected or was responsible for having collected. I want to say Alan not only thought about these sorts of measurement issues himself, he was also actively engaged in roping others into working on them too. When the Federal Economic Statistics Advisory Committee was created back in 2000, he was one of its inaugural members. He had a chance to engage with both academics and people at the statistical agencies in that context. I see a number of people here who were involved in something called the Princeton Data Improvement Initiative. Under that umbrella, Alan organized a conference that was held in 2008 that brought together a large group of people who were commissioned to write papers on possible approaches to improving some area of measurement. Bruce Meyer was there doing early work on the receipt of social welfare benefits. Alan Blinder was there reporting on work on measuring offshoring. Fran Blau and Larry Kahn were there reporting on work they'd done on better ways to ask on a household questions about experience on a household survey. Cecilia Rouse was there talking about a paper with co-authors on validating self-reported education. So I would say that his influence really went beyond his own work. I guess to sum up, I would say Alan had a significant effect on the economics profession, not only through the work he did on measurement issues, but just as important, I think, by sending the message that someone of his stature thought that measurement mattered. And I think it's made a real difference to the profession.
Well, thank you all. Those are all very fitting for a celebration of Alan's labor economics work. I want to say two things. One, I want to note an appreciation to Alan for actually helping us at EPI get started in our analysis of wages. I see my collaborator there, Jared Bernstein, but when we used to do the State of Working America every other year, and wages was always a major theme, and we wanted to analyze wages ourselves, and so we started working with the outgoing rotation group file, as many generations of economists have done since. But we started with the advantage of Alan giving us his program about how to measure things. It obviously gave us a huge, huge lift. I therefore was smart enough afterwards to hire one of his research assistants to come to EPI to work with the data. So that was a huge help for actually lifting us. In the prior State of Working America of 1990, we had to go to Larry Katz to get cross-tabulations of data. But thereafter, we were on our own. I want to just mention, talk about Alan's paper for the Jackson Hole convening. This is meetings of central bankers. It's not a pretty group, if you've been there. And it's not a worker-friendly group. And his paper, Reflections on Dwindling Worker Bargaining Power and Monetary Policy. Now, these economists have rarely been in a room when worker bargaining power has ever been mentioned or thought of as good. And the thing, and my age means I have to do this, but I want to just point out one paragraph and one footnote. Because I think it prefigures what I think is a turning point in labor economics going forward. And it says, although economists' go-to model of the labor market is often one with perfect competition, where bargaining power is irrelevant because supply and demand determine the wage and there is nothing firms can do about it, in many applications, I think it is more appropriate to model the labor market as imperfectly competitive, subject to monopsony-like effects, collusive behavior by firms, search frictions, and surpluses that are bargained over. As a result of these labor market features, firms should be viewed as wage setters or wage negotiators rather than wage takers. Now, the most amazing thing is that there's a footnote to this. And I wrote Alan and I told him, this is the greatest footnote of all time. It says, but it's also telling that it was a footnote. Notice that I don't call these features imperfections. They are the way the labor market works. The assumption of perfect competition is the deviation from the norm of imperfection as far as the labor market is concerned. Now, one of my heroes in labor economics was Secretary of Labor Ray Marshall, and he always said the invisible hand on the labor market is all thumbs. That was a shorthand for what Alan said. But, I think that labor economics, which for 40 years has varied from the basic institutionalist, structuralist understanding of power as being central to the labor market, it's now coming back in full force. And I think Alan was very much leading the way. And this paper is a signal to everyone to get with the program. And it's great that he did it in front of the bankers. With that, do we have questions have been collected or not? I will pose some. So are there other areas of Alan's work that you did? Larry, I think you got cut short. So I want to give you a minute. Did you get to cover your ground? Well, cover some more. I give you.
I think that the one thing I want to emphasize is that while I said some is that while we think about Alan as having the great natural experiment, others that really, as we've seen in this discussion, it was his willingness to put together a collage of data to study any issue. And in some sense, I think what Alan knew is what's memorable in economics is a combination of a sharp experiment, but also a sort of holistic explanation of the way the world works and pinning down the anecdotes from the discussion, as Alex talked about, of the actual actors in there being the ones that are more consistent with your explanation are more likely to be true, as well as pinning out the other data. And what's amazing about myth and measurement with David Card and Alan is not just that it has New Jersey and Pennsylvania, which is what's often the straw man version of it, but it's that there are 7 or 8 chapters that go in depth of how firms responded, the way different friction/imperfections in the labor market work in a way to get these results. And I think it's not surprising. I think, in some sense, the intellectual heritage that Alan was building on was not so much that of the fundamental econometrics of instrumental variables, but it was what his mentors, Richard Freeman, did in What Do Unions Do, with Jim Medoff giving you a broad picture. No one piece of evidence itself was perfect, but you saw a much broader view of a voice view of unions than just a monopoly view. It's what Milton Friedman did in the theory of permanent income, or in the monetary history with Anna Schwartz. It was a collage of evidence that had the rigorous econometrics, but also brought in models of the world and the broader information. As we saw from Catherine, Alan was amazing at figuring out the right questions to ask and then learning about what are the shortcomings by doing data in ways that you could verify whether something's true administratively or whether you gave the same answer twice to a question.
I want to mention some area of Alan's recent work that hasn't been talked about that illustrate something really important, which is that he was very topical. And labor economists at their best look at the world and what we need to know and what's going on now and tell us something about that. So this is the topic of like gig work. Alan wrote a paper using Uber data with the Uber chief economist on Uber Pay and much things about it. He wrote a policy paper with Seth Harris, so I think he knew from his undergraduate days at Cornell. I didn't agree with actually either of these papers, but they were both very good. You can never take anything Alan did lightly. You had to treat it with. I always treated it with the respect that it always deserved, that respect. But I want to also mention his work with Larry on trying to fill in for what the Bureau of Labor Statistics wasn't doing with the contingent worker survey. And that is a very brave thing, especially if you realize that at some point the Bureau of Labor Statistics may actually do the survey, as they did. And they did this survey, Alan and Larry, and brought forward the findings. I think they were a little bit misreported by the media, but it was very, very important and hard work to do. And it's like everything in economics. You're actually not trying to study the world. In some ways, you're trying to find out what BLS will say. It's like people say you don't forecast the economy. You want to forecast what BEA is going to say. So, it's very much like that. And then after the BLS came out with their data, and it was somewhat different, they went back and did the work to say, well, what did we learn from this experience? So, not to shy away from it. It's like, okay, we were off a bit. Wasn't, and so what did we learn by that? And that, I think that, that collecting of new data, that topical, of trying to learn from it, is very admirable, and I just want to call that out. Okay, so anyone want to add something while I read these questions?
I just want to pick up on the point that you were just making about Alan having a good eye for the topical topic, if you will. Another good example of that, I think, is the paper that he wrote with Judd Kramer and David Cho on long-term unemployment. We're coming out of the recession. There were all of these people who had been unemployed for a very long period of time, incredible interest in what was happening to these people, and he figured out a way to take a credible look at what the job finding success rates of those people were and to report on it. And it was, I think, work that was just enormously influential. And it was influential partly because it was very good work, but it was also influential because it came out on a timely basis when that question was still in everyone's mind, rather than 3 years after the end of the, 3 years after things had gotten back to normal, when it would have been an interesting piece of history.
I mean, that's obvious. I think we'll have someone talk about some of his policy work later. But obviously, when he was in government, he brought all these analytical skills to use. I recall a conversation with Alan. We at EPI had suggested some kind of employment tax credit to generate jobs in the middle of the recession. And Christy Romer and Alan were working on something very similar, and we went through the details. I remember my liking what he was doing, and he was liking what we had done better. It's kind of very funny. But I think he probably went too far into trying to be perfect about it in policy. But it was really, it's really great to have people that are there on the other end of a call to an administration who are really with that much intellectual firepower. That was quite remarkable.
Yeah, the one other thing I said is another area that always fascinated Alan that I think is very appropriate being here at Brookings was building off the work of Arthur Okun almost 45 years ago, is what is the impact of a tight labor market on more disadvantaged groups. And I think he was really, stellar at both using the standard national CPS data, but bringing geographic variation of what happened in really tight labor markets of and I think he was, as in his discussion with central bankers, there are just a lot of, things that work the willingness of firms to take chances on types of people they wouldn't hire otherwise, and the durable benefits of a tight labor market cannot be underestimated. And I think Alan was really at the forefront of bringing the micro data and linking it to the aggregate data, not just estimating Phillips curves on the aggregate, but looking at deciles of the wage distribution and showing how much it really takes a very tight labor market for those in the bottom part of the distribution to share in growth and wage growth. And that's an important lesson that we should not forget.
Well, your paper on that, on the 90s labor market, is quite nice, and I replicated that one recently. My only complaint is your acronym for the, which I can't even remember off the top of my head, but for the...
Alan gets complete credit for it because I don't even remember what it was.
This is a book edited by Alan Blinder and Janet Yellen, right? In Russell Sage or... Yeah. I wasn't putting you on the spot for that, but giving you praise for having published that. So there is one question here that asks, to what degree was Alan's work interdisciplinary? And maybe someone would talk.
I think it was highly interdisciplinary in the sense that he really went beyond textbook economics and was willing to think hard about the psychology, all the work on subjective well-being, of joint with people like Danny Kahneman and others, clearly, tried to push the frontiers of economics to not just only observe, revealed preference via choices, but to take seriously people's own assessments of their psychological well-being, the willingness to think about physical pain and try to measure it and link it, had a large connection to medical sciences. And I think, his picture of the labor market and the role of bargaining power both linked up to an old tradition in industrial relations, but also was very strongly related to sociology. So I think Alan was not someone who took a religious view of the field of economics, but was very open to influences in a wide range. And I think his work and the field of economics and policymaking is greatly enriched by that perspective.
One topic that's not on the agenda today has been his work on terrorism, which was controversial, I think, when it was written, but I think has held up quite well on the relationship between terrorism and poverty. And I've had conversations with political scientists who have told me that that work has had an impact in the political science and international relation, national security agenda.
I wonder how much of this, or maybe it reflects Alan's undergraduate degree in industrial and labor relations, or maybe it's someone who has broad interest, goes into industrial and labor relations. I don't know. But I think it is a lesson for future scholars to have a grounding in an interdisciplinary field. That's not to say I don't think you shouldn't specialize in economics for your PhD. You should, but it's good to be grounded in something broader, as Alan did. Because it's also good to have a mother as a teacher to get you thinking right about education. Any other comments? We're close to the end. Okay, why don't so thank you for the opportunity to celebrate Alan's work in labor economics. I remember when he told me he was thinking about becoming a dean, and I thought, oh my God, there goes another great researcher. What a waste.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.